Nowadays, being a bit older, I'm not into accolade chasing. I just want to cook good food that I could eat on an everyday basis, and I want to enjoy what I do. Like, you know, not to be rude, but I don't want to work 80, 90 hours a week. I don't want to put food in the plate with tweezers. Those days are behind me.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. It's all too easy to stereotype and pigeonhole cuisines. For instance, the food of Eastern Europe has often been classified by the ignorant as potatoes, cabbage, and vodka. But cuisines always speak of climate, of local produce, and of culture. Take Croatia, a country that is the original homeland of many new Australians. But what lies at the heart of their cuisine? Daniel Dobra is the head chef of Market Bistro in Maroochydore, Queensland. Daniel, how are you?
Very well. How are you today?
I'm good. It's been a pretty crazy period of time in southeast Queensland. What's it been like for you for the last week?
It has been pretty absolutely wild up here. Like the weather here is unlike anything I've ever seen before. Obviously, there's been flash flooding all over the area. We're pretty lucky where I'm located on the Sunshine Coast in Maroochydore. We've only skipped through it by the skin of our teeth, like literally a couple of suburbs up. Like, you know, you go 35 Ks up to Noosa and to Wanton, and they're like completely underwater. So we've been super lucky. But in saying that, like, we've had sunshine here the last 3 days, then today just the heavens opened again, and we saw more rain fall in 2 hours this morning than probably what fell in the space of a day while it was really wet up here. It was just the volume of water was gnarly, but luckily we're all safe. Everything's good.
Market Bistro has made an incredible name for itself in a short period of time. Tell us a little bit about the venue and what lured you to a role there.
So Market Bistro, like all jokes aside, we are just nothing less, nothing more than just a humble bistro on the coast. Like, there's a bit of a misconception that people perceive it as being fine dining, but that's not the case, and that's not what we want to express in ourselves. Like, all we want to do is provide good, honest food at a reasonable price for the masses, essentially. Like, you know, the ethos that we run behind is that, you know, any single person who walks through that door, it doesn't matter what they are, who they look like, how much money they make, how much money they don't make. It's all it is about is when that person walks through the door, all preconceived ideas of what we are get left at the door, and every person who comes will leave getting something they want on the menu. Like, you know, we don't want to label ourselves as a pretentious venue. We don't want to label ourselves as a fine dining venue. We're like, you know, if you want a steak, you can have a steak and fries and salad. You know, if you want a bowl of pasta, you can have a bowl of pasta. If you want to be a little bit more adventurous, you can be a little bit more adventurous. But I think it goes back to the age-old philosophy of good food, good, amazing ingredients, prepared well and executed flawlessly. You know, you slap a moderate price on that. You know, you provide great service in a simple setting, and you've got a recipe for success, you can say.
You've spent a lot of your career south of where you are. What made you move to the region?
Yeah, so obviously, like the lists and the droves of many other chefs who are in the same situation as me, COVID 2020 hit everyone super hard. Like, literally, I just opened a venue in Melbourne called Bistro Garçon. We were open for 4 weeks when COVID hit and we got shut down, and then sort of the drips and drabs and the misinformation and no one really knowing what's going on. And my wife and I, like, we were in Melbourne, like, you know, I've been in Melbourne for 17 years at this stage, and I was like holding on because Bistro Garçon was like, you know, a reckoning for me. Like, it was a chance of a lifetime. It was a dream venue, but unfortunately just wasn't meant to be. Like, kept waiting for things to settle down and kept waiting to reopen. And just, unfortunately, because we'd only been open for so long and we didn't have like financial history of the venue, no one was eligible for any sorts of payments or any sort of relief from the government. So I, like every other chef in Melbourne and Victoria, I started applying for jobs, literally tried to get work in whatever I could. Like, I applied for everything, like probably 200 different jobs on Seek, anything that I thought that I could do, like plant operator, garbage collector, prison guard, like literally applied for anything I could do because like I had to work. Like I couldn't afford to just have the unknowing and like this grey storm cloud over my head. So eventually what happened with me was the only two jobs out of like the 200 or so that I applied for that got back to me, one was the prison guard and another job was a chef in a nursing home. So the prison guard job was a government job, which was a government job. So like I went through like 6 rounds of interviews and continued to go through them. And by the time I got to like the 7th interview, I think that was the last one, the nursing home called me and said, "Oh, hey, we've got your resume. Do you want to come in for a chat?" And so I went in for a chat and I'm like, "Oh, how's it going?" They're like, "Yeah, it's good." They're like, "Yeah, it's been crazy. Like 2 months ago, we put a ad on Seek to get chefs and we got 4 applicants. Like, we put this job up a week ago and we got 470. So eventually what happened was I beat like 470 people to get this job in this nursing home out in Bentley. And I'd never set foot in a nursing home, let alone cooked in one before. And that was a really, really gnarly eye opener. So long story short, I ended up working there for just over 5 months, just hoping and praying and holding on to the fact that, we were going to come through COVID unscathed and we could reopen Bistro Garçon. But lo and behold, that was never meant to be. And unfortunately, it got to the point where my surroundings and setting that I was working was starting to have a real toll on myself, like not just physically, but emotionally more than anything. Like I'd never been in that situation, like, coming from working in nice restaurants and cooking for people, like, being in that situation, still trying to provide beautiful food on a shoestring budget to people who are in the twilight years of their life. Eventually it just got too much. And I got home from work one day and my wife was on the phone to one of our friends who lives up here on the Sunshine Coast. And they had a conversation saying, "Hey, why don't you guys move up?" And then she was like, "Oh yeah, I'll try and convince D when he gets home from work." I got home from work that day. Ashley's like, "Oh, hey, do you want to move?" I'm like, "Yep." I'm like, "Where do you want to go?" She's like, "I don't know, the Sunshine Coast." I'm like, "Yep." And like literally 7 weeks to the day, we were on a plane on our way up here. Like we just said, screw it. Like there's nothing going on for us in Victoria. There's no closure. And that was in September. That was still in the midst of like the huge lockdown that we had. So we moved up here literally with one friend, found an apartment to rent and just sort of jumped feet first into a brand new life and a brand new place. And like, both of us had never even been to the Sunshine Coast before we moved here. We were just like, well, anything's got to be better than Victoria. And, luckily we got here and instantly found a beautiful group of people to be friends with and just realized like, Queensland and Sunshine Coast up until this point have been relatively untouched from COVID. They had like the 28-day lockdown when it first happened, but other than that, their life was just normal. And so, coming from that repressive state that Victoria was in, that's where we're just like, holy crap, this place is paradise. And that was how I found myself to be on the Sunshine Coast. Now, moving forward, I ended up to get up here. I sort of just took any job I could find, and I ended up working for some guys, which unfortunately, it's not they were bad operators, but they were sort of like when I got to their group, I guess you can say their best years, unfortunately, were behind them. And I tried my hardest to make things work because I needed to make things work. But then one day, how I found out about Market Bistro, the owner of the whole group comes up to me. He's like, "Oh, one of our chefs has just quit. She's gone to go work with these guys." I'm like, "Oh, who are these guys?" And they're like, "Oh, it's a guy by the name of Tony Kelly. He's got Rice Boy. He's got Spiro. He's opening up venues, been super successful. And then I looked. And we're flicking through and he's like, "Oh, this is their Instagram. Oh, have you ever heard of this chef?" And I'm like, he shows me this picture of Harry. I'm like, "Oh, fuck, Harry, yeah. Like, I've absolutely heard of him. Like, he's long time Melbourne chef. And like quite a few of my mates have worked for Harry in Melbourne at various places. And I'm like, they're like, "Oh, what do you reckon of this?" I'm like, "Fuck, if he's there, the place is going to be amazing. Like, hands down." Because he doesn't cook shit. Doesn't cook shit, cooks good food, and then he's honest about it. So that's how that started. And then through a friend of mine, I'm like, because I never actually knew Harry personally, just knew of him. Texted one of my mates, and I'm like, "Hey, can you make an introduction? Like, I'm not really happy where I'm at. And can you make an introduction with Harry?" And so then literally he's like, "Yeah, man, no worries." He texted Harry. Harry called me like the next day and went in for a chat. And I guess you can say the rest is history. It all sort of like moved up here. I was here for maybe 2 months working in a place I wasn't probably really happy with. And literally just decided to leave and move over to Market Bistro, and that's it. The rest is history. It's all been sunshine, lollipops, and roses.
Take us back to when you were young. You've got incredible Croatian heritage, and on Instagram you've explored that before in the past with some incredible dishes and things like that. Take us back to when you were young. What sort of role did food play in your family?
So food in my family was like the biggest. It was sort of the biggest. Like, so it's. To get to actually the root of the answer, you need to go back a bit further. So unfortunately, my parents separated when I was about 4 years old, and my mother is Australian, my father's Croatian. So my brother and I lived with my mother like all year round, but during school holidays, we would spend the whole 2-week school holidays every year up until I was about 12 or 13 with my dad. I come from a small town called Esperance on the southeast coast of WA, only 13,000 people, small place. So my dad would pick us up, we'd drive to Perth, and we'd spend the full 2-week school holidays, like every school holidays in Perth with my dad, with like all my dad's side of the family. So all my Croatian roots all lied in Perth. With my dad's side of the family. So a lot of those first memories of family and of togetherness, of aunties, of uncles, of nonna, and all those things that I can relate to. It was all with my Croatian side of the family. So the Croatian food and all the food which initially I first took to just be normal, like I thought cooking Spanish mackerel marinated in garlic and passing olive oil over charcoal, I thought that was a normal thing. Like, I thought cevaps were a normal thing. I thought cabbage rolls were a normal thing. But it was only until I got a little bit older that I realised how blessed and how gifted I'd been with food, and to have that sort of influence on my life from such an early age. Like family and food, and my nonna, so like my dad's mother, she was an absolutely amazing cook, and still to this day, like I've made gnocchi in some amazing restaurants all over. Still to this day, I don't know how my nonna used to make like little fluffy clouds of heaven. Like still don't know. Like, so food was a huge part. It was always like, Sunday lunch or Friday night dinner, like being in Perth, because we were there, all the aunties, all the uncles, all the cousins, everyone would always show up because we were there. And it was this big, beautiful family togetherness and this big, beautiful belonging of all being in the same place, all enjoying beautiful food. And, like, every time we're there, there'd always be some garage party where there was a pig on the spit or a lamb on the spit, and like the piano accordion would come out, and there was way too much grappa and rakia drunk, and like they're the memories that I have of childhood, which sort of, not to say that my mum wasn't family orientated, but most of the family orientated memories were around my dad's side of the family. So like with Croatian food, and I always like in my heart and my soul feel I'm more Croatian than Australian, even though that's completely not the case. Like I'm a 50-50 mix, and I grew up in Australia, and any full-blooded Crow would call me a dinky-die Aussie. But for me personally, growing up around those people and growing up around that culture and around that food really gave me this amazing sense of pride and sense of who I am and where I'm from and what I am. And, you know, which has massively, massively influenced me all throughout my life and all throughout the food that I've cooked, not just the food that I cook in restaurants, but the food that I cook at home every day.
Croatian food has easily been stereotyped, but tell us about some of the dishes that that you love and you remember and still cook to this day that speak of Croatian food.
Yes. So if you look at Croatian food, there's two distinct styles of Croatian food. So you have the Mediterranean style, which is all the part of Croatia. Like obviously you're familiar with the map. There's the coast of Dalmatia, which goes right from the northernmost tip in Slovenia all the way down to the base near Macedonia. And so the Mediterranean side of Croatian food, that's where my family comes from. They come from Dalmatia, the coastal region. So it's probably the biggest mix of Italian, Greek, and Turkish food. Obviously, Croatia's been fought over for centuries and centuries by various world powers. So within all of those people who once upon a time owned or controlled Croatia, they all left their open marks on food. But to look at Croatian food as such, so you've got the Mediterranean side, so things are super fresh, like lots of garlic, lots of parsley, lots of olive oil, lots of vinegar, you know, lots and lots and lots of handmade pastas, lots of sweet pastries, you know, lots of charcoal grilling. Whereas if you were to look at the other part of Croatia, which is they class as the continental side of Croatia, which is all of the inland regions. So like, you know, a lot of influence from Hungary and Austria and, all the other countries that sort of are near of and or border the inland part of Croatia. So their style of food, it's not necessarily a lot richer, but it is a lot heavier. That's like, you know, a lot of the sauerkraut dishes, a lot of the cured meat, smoked fishes, like, you know, a lot of those heavier dishes which people would say, oh yeah, this is Eastern European food. That's where that style of food comes from. You know, the whole cabbage, potatoes, smoked pork vibe. That generally and truthfully is the continental part of Croatia. So obviously growing up, my family being from the Mediterranean side, that was like where our food reflected. But like, you know, all through Croatia, they make cabbage rolls or sarma. They make them everywhere all over Croatia. But, you know, from the cabbage rolls they eat on the coast are different to the cabbage rolls they eat inland. The cabbage rolls they eat inland are usually made, as opposed to like fresh smoked pork, they're usually made with dried pork, which they reconstitute in water. And then like, you know, the cabbage rolls are usually eaten with like a mashed potato and then a dollop of sour cream on top. Whereas coastal wise, they don't. It's none of that. It's literally it's fresh minced meat with fresh smoked bacon cooked in like a really light tomato sauce. So that's just a brief example. Some of the food which I cook and some of my like, you know, go-tos. So goulash is like every winter it's time to make goulash for me. So like, you know, that's your classic you know, boiled, it's basically boiled meat flavored with tomato, flavored with wine, flavored with spices, and then vegetables get added to it. So like, you know, not necessarily, it's not thick like a stew. You know, you've got tender bits of meat with beautifully flavored vegetables with soft potatoes in like, you know, what essentially is a really light broth, which they're some of the things. That's definitely one of the things I make. every time I get. There's a few other little things which they call it. One of the names is blitva, also known as zelio, which is just a really simple stew made of potatoes, stewed beet, garlic, olive oil, salt, and pepper. That's literally made. That's like one of those side dishes which is always around, always there. Traditionally eaten with fish, but once again eaten with everything. Chivapis. Like, we used to make our own chivapis when the family was around. Like, obviously, as times got longer, we used to go to the butcher to buy them. So, in terms of dishes, there's some other particular dishes which are sort of very related only to certain areas of Croatia. So, like all the coast, which is a thing that we used to do, which is called the peka, which is like something which I've never really seen it anywhere else other than the coastal region of Croatia or from the people who came from the coastal region of Croatia in Australia. So peka is basically cooking things in a camp oven, except you've got a particular size dish that you place everything in, and you've got this great big thick cast iron dome bell. You light a fire with charcoal and wood. Once the fire's at its highest flames, you throw this huge big cast iron bell over one side of the fire. This big cast iron bell heats up to roaring like 400 or 500 degrees Celsius. Where the fire was, you wait till the fire's burned down to charcoal. You split the fire in half, slide the most traditional one they make is it's turkey, pork and lamb. You line the base of this round dish with potatoes, peppers, onions, garlic, rosemary, bay leaves, olive oil, wine, salt, pepper. Place all your meat on top. Slide that into the place where the fire was burning. This big like roaring hot iron dome goes over. All the charcoal that was burned down, you push that all around the sides and shovel it over the top. Now, the amazing thing which happens behind this is when the iron hits the tray, basically the tray underneath swells and heats up, almost forms like a perfect seal within this peka. So what happens is no steam can escape. So, realistically, you can cook a lamb shoulder in about an hour and a half because it's like a pressure cooker. So for about an hour and a half, it'll literally cook. Takes, you can cook a chicken in 40 minutes to the point where it's like falling apart. So you create this, what essentially is a charcoal fired like steam and pressure cooker. All the flavor of the smoke and the charcoal still finds its way in there somehow. Once after about an hour and a half, get a hammer, bang the side of it, cracks, breaks, a big puff of steam will come out. You lift the lid to get all the moisture out of there, close the lid back down, and then within probably 10 to 15 minutes, all of that heat that's still residual within the lid of the dome literally caramelizes everything, and it'll literally look like everything you've got in there will look like it's been roasted in a 200-degree oven for an hour. Like it goes from steamed to roast instantaneously. And that's something truly, truly unique. Like that's something that I've seen that isn't replicated anywhere else, anywhere in the world. So when you think of Croatian food, that's like the stuff that I think, which, is really, really special. And unfortunately, like it still happens there, but it's something that you just don't ever see anywhere else.
You mentioned you had about 17 years in Melbourne, which is extraordinary as part of your career. But what's been the real integral moments in your career that have helped forge the path for you?
So I think there's probably if I was to pinpoint a few moments, there's been sort of 2 or 3 moments which truly changed me as a chef. When I first moved here, I literally just turned 18, moved over. The very first person that I worked for when I got here was a chef by the name of Joe Vargetto. I worked with him and Luke Stringer, who I actually work with now at Bistro, funnily enough. It's funny how these things go around and come around. So when I first moved here, I started working with Joe, and Joe was the first person who ever sort of who took a real interest in me and a real interest to actually train me and teach me right from wrong. I learned more about life. Learned more about life and myself working 6 months with him. Like, the whole yes chef, no chef, the whole respect, the camaraderie. I learned more about life and learned more about how to be a man and about how to be like what it actually took to be a chef than anyone else in my life. He played a huge instrumental part in sort of setting me up for my life as a chef. Moving a little bit forward, a few years later, I was working at Phoenix Restaurant in Richmond, and this was when the Dream Team lineup was there, when Darren Purchase was the pastry chef, Dan Hunter was the head chef, and Stuart McVeigh was the executive chef. Unfortunately, like most Dream Teams happen, it was very well short-lived. Unfortunately, Dan left, Darren left, and I was there working with Stuart. Now, Stuart was a huge inspiration and mentor to my life. Obviously, with his background, working 3-star place and 2-star place before he came to Australia, and his passion and his excitement for food and, his technique and his mentality and his personality and, his work ethic. Like, I took so much from him in the actual physical and technical side of cookery, like, with the stories that he'd tell about the food that we'd cook and the food that we'd speak about, like, that sort of really inspired me to sort of pursue food in the sense of, like hard work and determination and pushing and like, of what it took to stand out from the rest and what it took to be better. I guess you can say the third and final major sort of inspiration to me as a chef was after Phoenix, I left and went to go work with Dan Hunter, just as he'd gone to open the Royal Mail. Like, I think he was there for maybe 2 or 3 months when I arrived. And like anyone who remembers the Royal Mail back in the day, and like we're talking 2007 here. Like when I got there, like the place was pretty wild to say. Like things were still pretty loose in the sense that, like, it was a guy who was working at the 2 Michelin star level in the middle of nowhere, cooking the most unbelievable, crazy food in a town of 400 people. Like things just didn't make sense. But like through that first team that we had there, like, there was myself and probably 5 or 6 other guys who we were all there from the start together. I think the first one left after about 18 months. But what we did there under the guidance of Dan and, like, Dan's clinical execution of order, cleanliness and organisation is still something I've to date have never seen in a kitchen. Like for someone who has such a fine-tuned palate, for someone who has such a strict philosophy in how things are supposed to be done and how things need to be done, and the cleanliness, order, and organisation that is kept, that sort of without his sort of fine tuning of my already skill and ability that was prevalent there. Without that, I wouldn't be half the chef I am today, because the lessons that I learned from him, not just in terms of methodology of food, but in terms of, what it actually takes to cook at that level consistently. Like, any chef can cook an amazing meal once. Like, testament to a truly great chef is repetition of that amazing meal and experience. And that's what I took from him. Like, just and like, let's be honest, that place was that place was fucking hard, man. Like, we're doing 13 days straight, 100-hour weeks, like 1 day off every 2 weeks. Like, that place was fucking hard. But like, we had such a strong knit team of guys there and working with us that, like, it was on one hand, it was every man for himself. On the other hand, if ever in the shit or something was wrong, it's literally like the entire team would come together and we'd all get through it together. That sort of taught me like some of the lessons that I learned there, like, and because the food was, some of the things we're doing was so fucking preposterous and so hard, and like things where Dan had been used to having 40 stages in a back room to do, like there's like, oh yeah, there's 8 blokes doing it themselves. So like some of the things we did there was just like, I think back now and it's like, fucking, like how did we get through it? But like, you know, like with anything good, if it's worth it, you find a way and you make it work. So in terms of inspiration, they're the sort of the 3 guys, the 3 people who sort of really made a lasting impression in terms of mentoring me as a young chef. But, you know, even in saying that, like only a fool thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. Like I'm now 35 years old. I've been working with Harry for almost 12 months. Harry's a 54-year-old man. And I look at the guy and I'm just like, fuck, Harry, you're 54 years old, but you've got as much energy as anyone else. You run circles around most people. Like, I'm still getting to that stage where I'm like, I'm a 35-year-old man. You're 19 years older than me. Like, you're 19 years older than me and you're still moving and shaking. So, like, now I've sort of gotten to this, I'm not going to say twilight, but I've gotten to a mature age of my life where I'm still inspired every day by other people who are not necessarily better than me, but other people who are still so passionate and so involved. And it's an amazing thing to see.
Do you have a story about, or was there a moment when you realized you sort of found your own voice on the plate, or the way that you like to cook and express food? Yeah.
So like you gotta wind back the clock for this one. Like, you wind back the clock, you got to look at the mentality and what it was to work in, you know, those sorts of kitchens back in the day. Like, everyone talks about the Gordon Ramsay shit and the hardness and the yelling and the swearing. But, like, I was lucky because I was one of the last generations of chefs who experienced that in its most rawest and like in its most raw form and its entirety, like the physical and verbal and mental abuse that I've had to deal with in these places. Like, nowadays it doesn't stand anymore and you can't get away with that sort of stuff. But back then, it's either you grew a thick skin or there's the door, because there's, you know, 100 people to replace you. It's no problem. So to look at this, you got to take that mentality involved. Like, I, from a very, very early age, was just beaten down. I had like natural skill and natural talent, but like any young chef, make mistakes. So it was always drummed into my head that, yeah, it didn't matter how good I was, because deep down I was worthless. Because that was the mentality that chefs wanted to have that hold over you. They wanted to keep you on such a short leash that, you know, even if you were the best, strongest chef in the kitchen, they'd never tell you that, because they didn't want you to get an ego and they didn't want you to leave, because they relied upon you. So for years and years and years, I knew that I could cook, and I knew that I had natural talent and natural skill and natural ability. But I was this sort of, like, I guess you can say, beaten puppy mentality. Like, I knew it, but I still didn't know it, so to say. So just before I was about to open my first restaurant, I got back from overseas, we'd been on, like, you know, a 5-month holiday, spent 3 months in Croatia, because at that time I was about to open Eastern European Croatian restaurant. So I wanted to, like, really get back to my roots and do, like, a proper tour. So I knew what I was getting myself into. So I'd come back, I'd needed a job. I started working with Salvatore Malatesta at St. Ali. And, like, you know, I'd stepped in this kitchen as a cafe. I'd sort of, like, you know, I'm like, oh, you know, I want to make money, but I don't want anything too crazy, because I've got, like, you know, a big mission ahead of me. And it was one day where I'd put a special or something on the menu, and Sal tried, and he's like, holy fucking shit, that was amazing. And then And I'm like, was it really? And he's like, yeah. And he's just like, Sal looks at me. And I remember this day like it was yesterday. And this was like before the renovation, before everything, working in the shitbox kitchen. No offense, Sal, but it was true because he knows it. Working in the shitbox kitchen. And Sal's just like, that fucking piece of snapper was unbelievable. Thank you so much. And I'm like, oh, I'm just a shit bloke who can't cook. And he's like, man, you can actually cook. And no one up until that point, no one who was ever a boss or who was ever a mentor to me had ever told me anything like that. That was the first person who ever actually said, hey, Dobbers, hold on a second, just take a step back. You can actually cook. And that for me was a huge turning point in my life, because once I'm being told that, and once someone actually stopped and sat me down and said that to me, that was the biggest confidence boost and the biggest thing that I needed. Because like up until that point, I started cooking in 2004, so that's like 9 years later. Like up until that point, like I had still genuinely thought that like, yeah, I was good, but I was worthless. So that was a huge moment for me. And like that sort of, it was like from like you look in this day and age, you got guys who do 3 years of school, they do 1 year of work in a place, then all of a sudden they're head chef. Like 4 or 5 years down the head chef. Like it was 10, almost 11 years before I even took a senior role in the kitchen, only because of that was the mentality that was thrust upon me from being a young chef.
You've really come into your own at Market Bistro and working with Harry as well. What do you love about what you're doing at the moment?
I think like a lot of chefs, like now, not to bullshit, not to do anything like this. It's very like for the real chefs who care, who genuinely have a love for this industry and love what they do. It's not very often where all the planets align and everything's fucking perfect. Like I can honestly say in all the years I've been a chef, which is coming up now to like 21, 22 years of actually been working in kitchens. Like I've had this experience with what I've got now at Market Bistro, I think maybe 3 or 4 times in my whole life. Like where, that I'm coming into my own because I've got amazing people around me. I've got like literally like an amazing bunch of people around me. I've got a fantastic support network, and I've got, an executive chef who is an amazing person just to be there, who supports me, who we bounce off ideas together. Like literally we run it together. And like I've got an amazing boss who owns a place, who was a chef once upon a time. So every issue that I have, I bring up with him, and he genuinely knows and understands it and can offer genuine help and advice. So coming into my own, it's I guess you can say it's a group of whole different things all working together in harmony, which has sort of made my life so joyous and so easy. Like, nowadays being a bit older, I'm not into accolade chasing. I just want to cook good food that I could eat on an everyday basis. And I want to enjoy what I do. Like, not to be rude, but I don't want to work 80, 90 hours a week. I don't want to put food in the plate with tweezers. Like, I want to cook good food. I want to do it and do it well. But like the days of being a pretentious guy where, there'd be 35 things on the plate where you had to taste everything individually and actually really had to think about it to understand it. Those days are behind me. And, once again, I'm not discrediting those people who work in those places, but that's just not who I am as a chef anymore. I've sort of come into my own because I guess through all the years of experience and the years of training, the years of knowledge, I finally found a venue where I'm supported in such a way that my life is easy. Like, it's not hard to cook good food when you're working in a happy, healthy, positive environment with people who are around you who generally care.
Well, that's an amazing place to be in. And Daniel, it's amazing to hear just a bit of your story. Please keep in touch, and we'll definitely have to catch up again soon.
Yeah, fantastic.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.